All right, fantastic. So thank you all for joining us. We're about to well, we'll kick off now. Um, so actually, one of the challenges we had with this session was the credibility of the panel, because they're so highly regarded that no one could believe that they'd once been EYPers. So of course, I had to get photographic evidence of their involvement in EYP. And unfortunately, I didn't have the time to get the pictures together. So they've been let off today. But just as a warning, next time, maybe I'll if I've got a bit more time, I'll find that photographic evidence of you. No, Marcus doesn't. Marcus is shaking his head.
There will be no
All
next
right.
time.
Fantastic. So welcome to this panel session. And the topic for today, which I'm just going to bring up, is a panel debate on rising nationalism and populism across the globe, particularly as well what EYP alumni can do to revert the trends or do something about that. So that's the discussion we'll be having. And we've got four great panelists, obviously former EYPers for you. So I'll introduce them one by one, and then each one of them, I'll introduce them all together, and then each one will do a little brief intro and their thoughts for about 3 minutes, and then we'll just go straight to an open Q&A session for the rest of the time. So we want to make this very interactive. So Ezra, I'm going to introduce first, and please forgive me if I don't pronounce your middle and surname properly, but Ezra Bulut Ahmad is a researcher. She's taken a break from full-time employment to care for her children, and is an adjunct lecturer in politics at Sciences in Saint-Germain-en-Laye. Sorry again, my pronunciations. And prior to the career break, she was a senior research fellow at the European Union Institute for Security Studies, and has also worked for the International Crisis Group, UNDP, and the London School of Economics, where she completed her doctorate. She is British, French, Turkish, and resides near Paris with her sons. The one thing that people may not know about her is that she regrets that she did not do more for the Remain campaign ahead of the 2016 UK referendum. What she wanted to be when she grew up was an air hostess, and she actually had a British Airways air hostess when she was about 7 years old, but she might tell you why that's no longer her dream. Her first EYP session was Gothenburg 95 as part of the Turkish delegation, and her last was Brussels in 99 as president. Her favorite EYP memory is standing for the European anthem whenever that happened, and her children sing and play on toy percussion, and it still transports her back to EYP instantly. Daniel Johnson has been a member of the Scottish Parliament since 2016 and played an active role during the Scottish independence referendum, campaigning for Scotland to remain in the UK, and he's currently the Vice Chair of the Parliament's Education Committee and takes an interest in justice and economic issues. What we don't know about him is that his political tactics are mainly influenced by his love of gangster movies. When he said when he wanted to grow up, he wanted to be awkward, and he's been quite successful at that. And his first EYP session was Berlin 2004, and he finished, I think, as head organizer in Edinburgh in, sorry, not 2004, 94, and finished as head organizer in Edinburgh 97. And his favorite EYP memory is definitely Gothenburg, and either chairing a committee for the first time or the entire chairs team stayed on a Viking ship in Gothenburg Harbor. And so we won't go into more details about that, but I can imagine that was a lot of fun. Marcus Roberts has worked on campaigns for liberal and left of centre parties around the world for over 20 years. He served as field director, communications consultant, chief strategist, and campaign manager on races as varied as local council election to Sadiq Khan's London Labour London mayoral bid. He's pursued research interests at think tanks in New York, London, Brussels, and Berlin. And for the last 3 years, he has led YouGov's international political work for governmental political parties and civil society clients in 24 countries. He serves on the European Union Expert Advisory Group on populist and far-right politics. What he'd like to do, what was not known about him, anyone might not know about him, was that he was married by an EYPer. So Martin Kamenisch was his priest at his wedding. And when he was young, he wanted to grow up to be Secretary General of NATO. Yes, when he was 6 or 7 years old, that's what he wanted to be. And his favorite EYP memory is dancing Ce soir-là in the Swiss Parliament during Bern, I would assume. And finally, Cecilia. She currently works as the Women, Peace and Security Specialist for UN's Women's Syria Program in Beirut. She supports the UN-led Syria negotiations in Geneva and grassroots dialogues inside Syria. Before moving to Beirut, she worked for UN Women in Geneva, as well as the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Justice and Corrections Service of the UN Department of Peacekeeping Operations in New York. And she also supports the UN Mediator Special Envoy on gender and women's rights issues. What we would not know about her is that she grew up as a child in the Netherlands, and she's Finnish. So before '95, Finland was not a member of the EU, and her mother was not very good at keeping documents. So when they used to cross the border in their car, basically her mum would hide her in the trunk or under towels. So when Finland finally joined the EU, she was very happy because she didn't need to hide at border crossings anymore. When she was young, what she wanted to be when she grew up was a horseback riding instructor. She started EYP in 2003 when she was 15, did her first international session in 2007, and has done various roles and sat on the board of EYP Finland and lots of other things. And her favorite EYP memory was the possibility to participate in the 2007 EMYP session. I think, is that the European Mediterranean Youth Parliament, Cecilia?
That's it.
Yeah. And it defined her career forever, as she was convinced she wanted to work on conflict resolution in the Middle East, and she's still in touch with a lot of people. So thank you there for our panelists for joining us. So what I'd like to do is ask everyone if you could switch to speaker view, so you'd be able to see the person that's speaking. And I'd like to invite each one in turn to do a short viewpoint. I think we'll go in the order that we'd agreed, which would be Ezra, Daniel, Daniel, Marcus, and then Cecilia. So if I could ask Ezra to start.
Thank you very much. I'll just put my timer on. But so please do intervene if I run over. I have a feeling I may run over, so please do be brutal with me. Thanks all for logging in. Thank you very much to EYP for organising this event. Thanks Sol for herding us as speakers along. I will briefly talk about the topic by trying to unpack it, basically unpack the title of the panel debate, and hopefully that will then allow the other speakers to go into more detail with their own unique perspectives. So the panel debate, Rising Nationalism and Populism Across the Globe, and what EYP alumni can do to revert the trends. Now, I think what's interesting about this title is it invites us to think of nationalism and populism together. And what I'd like to kind of playfully challenge you to do is try and actually separate them out during this discussion a little bit, to the extent that I don't think these ideologies naturally go together, and it's quite interesting that at the moment a lot of international discussion pushes us towards assumptions that they naturally go together, that they're good bedfellows. And I would like to challenge that and actually say they're no closer. Populism and nationalism are no closer to each other than either nationalism is to democracy or populism is to democracy. So I'd like to bring in democracy straight away, because I think that's essentially the heart of the answer to the second part of the debate, i.e. what can EYP alumni do? And so if we take these three things as a trilogy, I'd say that we've got to keep democracy at the forefront of our thoughts and our debates throughout any discussion of nationalism and populism. So if we shouldn't just be taking them together, what should we be doing? I'd suggest we quickly look at what they share, and they share a few things. From an academic perspective, if we're going to look at this a little bit in terms of academic theory, they're both actually quite similar in terms of being thin ideologies. They're ideologies that, rather than providing a comprehensive framework for believers, instead they actually take a few core beliefs, core ideas, and run with them. And that's probably the secret to their success. Of course, the other thing that naturally makes us think of nationalism and populism together are the centrality of the concept of the people in both of these. But before going further on that, I'd like to unpack each of these separately. So I'd start with nationalism, and I would suggest that it's more interesting really to look at nationalism as a framework for all of our politics, or as the ideology that helps drive the basic framework for most of our politics as it stands in the world today, than as something that is on the ascendance. You know, the anti-racist, the anti-racism marches in America have got many very useful slogans or interesting slogans out there at the moment. I think the most important one and relevant to this discussion is the idea that the system isn't broken, it was built this way. So if we're going to talk about nationalism and its excesses, we've got to look at how much nationalism is central to defining the nation states that we live in around the world and the international world we live in. Very briefly, I'd say that the nationalism and populism, both their danger, their attraction and their danger lies in their apparent simplicity. And that simplicity derives from their reference to the people. Nationalism looks very much, nationalism focuses on the idea that the nation is the self-evident organizing unit for the world, and that the world is divided into nations, and every nation deserves its own state or should have its own state. And of course, there's the question of this, the mismatch between this message and the reality of the world, which is a lot more diverse than nationalism might lead us to believe. Now, a difference between nationalism. Oh, are we running out of time already?
Yes. You would have.
Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. Okay, so if nationalism pits nations against nations and nations against their internal enemies, populism, I think, is much more a anti-elite movement overall. If we're going to look for a kind of a key aspect that goes across many different cases or types of populism around the world, and here the idea is very much that the people are pitted against an elite, and there the claims to be anti-establishment often jar with the reality that many of the people within populist movements are themselves the product of deepest kind of establishment. So there, if we're going to unpack populism, we've got to look a lot more at how populism piggybacks, as other academics have mentioned, piggybacks on other ideologies. And that explains why there's so much diversity in populist politics today. I think it's really important that we do not equate populism with popular politics. And I think that that's actually where some of the solutions, potential solutions to the emptiness of populism come up, and that is that popular politics is something that liberal democracy needs to harness to its favor. And as I think as EYPers, it's the fact that EYP gave us a taste for the functioning of liberal democracy that marks us out as kind of young alumni, or now not so long young alumni. And I have some ideas for how the EYP experience has really shaped us, and in a way that might make us particularly resilient or useful for dealing with populist and nationalist politics. But obviously I'll maybe leave that for debate time in case anyone's actually interested. I can pick up on that again. Thank you. Thank you,
Ezra. Could I ask Daniel to go next?
Of course, thank you. So I guess I'm here to give the voice from the trenches on the war against nationalism. So I think it's important to point out I'm not just a member of the Scottish Parliament, but I'm a Labour member of the Scottish Parliament. And I think if, in a sense, what we have faced over the last 6 years in Scottish politics, a little bit more than, it is really a kind of an incessant advance of nationalist politics. And hopefully there are some lessons to be learned from that, because I think nationalism in Scotland looks very different to the nationalism that we might have had in our heads, certainly when we were doing EYP, and certainly I think potentially when we look at it from a more theoretical perspective. And when I was thinking about my preparation for this afternoon, I think in a sense, one thing sums it up. When the tweet went out publicizing this event, I hesitated before I retweeted. I wasn't sure that was something I wanted to do, because me tweeting about the fact that I was speaking at an event talking about nationalism had the very real risk of unleashing an absolute torrent of abuse from SNP, Scottish National Party activists on Twitter. And I think that's sort of symptomatic of what has happened since the independence referendum in Scotland, is that we have an extremely polarized politics. Everything is now seen through the prism of whether you are for or against independence. And that is that the first question that anyone will really ask themselves before they engage in political debate. I mean, to the extent that when you look at both Black Lives Matters protests that have been taking place, and also the coronavirus crisis in Scotland, you very, very quickly move to discussions about where that pitches you on the pro or anti-independence divide. It absolutely subsumes absolutely everything else. Now, there are many who would argue with me about whether or not the SNP are a nationalist party. And indeed, on many levels, they share many liberal social democratic values that we would all agree with and few would disagree with. But they are nationalists, I think, in several key regards. First of all, their politics is very much based on identity, Scottish identity. But furthermore, it also has exceptionalism absolutely at its heart. That independence essentially is the single magic bullet policy that will fix everything else. And I think politics of identity and exceptionalism is absolutely core to, I think, nationalist politics in the 21st century. But I think the other thing to layer in, and it's quite important, is that, and I think this maybe speaks to some of the points that Ezra was bringing up, that nationalism in the 21st century is impossible to divorce from the means by which it communicates. Social media has completely changed, I think, the nature of nationalist politics, how it operates, and how it brings people in. And it has enabled a sense of community and identity which would simply be impossible before, but is also much more flexible than previous, I think, nationalist identities have been. So I think I'm probably coming up on my 3 minutes there, but I think the thing that I would say in terms of lessons in thinking about how we move forward is I think we must also actually learn lessons of what populist and nationalist politicians have been doing, what populist and nationalist politics, how they operate. And I know Marcus is going to speak a bit more about that, but fundamentally, I think we in terms of liberal center, right and center left politics have been too focused on policy and detail. And we've missed the point in terms of how we actually appeal to people, how we make them feel included, and how they form part and how we speak to them. I think the most misunderstood word in politics today is narrative. People think the narrative is about essentially how you explain your policies, and it is not. It actually explains how your thinking, your orientation, and more importantly, how the people you're speaking to fit within what you are attempting to do through politics. It is a story about how you are connected to them and they are connected to you. And that's what we have forgotten how to do in I think, mainstream politics. And at that, I will stop, and I'm sure Marcus is going to say more about it.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thanks very much, Daniel. I started my EYP life in Granada in 1998 on the Committee of Institutional Affairs. And we were discussing then the end of the nation state. And I feel in this debate that we're having now, a lot of those echoes from 22 years ago come again in terms of the tensions that people feel in their politics and where this might take us next. So I'm going to talk today about 2 things: where this politics comes from and what might come next. So we could look at the first slide, please. This shows that more people think that their country has become less democratic rather than more democratic over the last 5 years. This isn't just the case in Spain or the UK, it's also the case across Europe and in the US as well. So there's a rising concern about a loss of democracy in our countries, and that is a key factor in driving this so-called populist politics. Next slide, please. We also know that underpinning this is concern, particularly in Northern and Western European nations, around immigration, but interestingly, that's matched or rather mirrored by a concern about emigration or a brain drain coming out of Southern and Eastern European countries. And that means that populist politics is going to play out differently in Northern and Western European countries from Southern and Eastern European nations, as this difficult and more complicated politics of migration plays out over the course of the next decade or so. And the next slide, please, Helena. Against this backdrop, the rise in so-called populist politics is being fueled by a decline in trust in major media and establishment media channels. This is an example from the United Kingdom, but I could show you similar examples from France and Germany and across Europe, and very much so, I'm afraid to say, is the case in the United States as well. On the bright side, though, if we look at the next slide, and here we begin to come into areas of what might come next. We see trust in community figures as being high. People trusting their doctors, trusting their teachers, trusting their local politicians, trusting members of the judiciary, a bit less so. But all of that speaks to the importance of a more community-based approach to the politics that might get us out of this mess at the moment. Then if we look at the next thing, please, we see that social liberalism can be a source of strength in our societies. Too often we see populist politicians saying that there are great big divides between middle-class voters and blue-collar voters, between higher income, higher education workers and lower income, lower education workers. And this isn't anywhere near as true as some of the bad guys of politics would have us believe. When it comes to important things like equal marriage, when it comes to important things like gender equality, you'll discover that there's majority support even amongst lower income and lower education voters, just as there is amongst their middle-class compatriots. So we should remember that our social liberalism can be a source of strength in countering this negative politics. And then if we move on, please. This is more challenging for us. We need to accept, and you would see very similar numbers looking at other European countries as well, this examples from the UK, that you will find high levels of support for tighter controls on immigration. This is even across the left's coalition. Not even talking about all voters here. I'm talking about left-wing voters, be they LGBT+, be they ethnic minorities, be they lower income, lower education, be they middle class. There's this majority support for a greater care and caution and a tighter control over immigration. To favor a tighter control over immigration is not to be a racist. And if centrists, liberals of the center left or center right, ever allow ourselves to fall into the trap of automatically equating a concern about immigration with racism, then all we do is drive more voters into the arms of the true racists in terms of those so-called populist politicians, and we endanger our politics even more.
Marcus,
so then let's look at let's look at the final slide, and I'll wrap up, which is where do we go next with all of this politics? There's broad-based support for more redistribution of wealth, but not just redistribution of wealth, or redistribution of power. Multiculturalism and support for equality can be a strong source of agreement between the different cleavages within our society. And then, of course, there's support for policy engagement, like initiatives like non-university or vocational education, the tax and regulation of large companies that have been driving some of the greatest inequalities of globalization. And my final point is therefore this. When we were in EYP, one of the best things that we got was our understanding that other people are different from ourselves, but that we could learn from them. If we practice that very politics that EYP taught us again in our own life and lives and livelihoods, then we can understand with one another how these cleavages have come across in our politics, and also what it is that we can do to try to bridge them in the future. As Atticus Finch says in To Kill a Mockingbird, the best thing you can do is walk a mile in another person's shoes to really understand them. And I think empathy, heart, and caring and respect for others can really help us learn how it is that we can build a better politics in the future. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Marcus. Just before we go to Cecilia, I'd just like to mention, if you could start putting your questions in the chat, what questions you've had so far, and we will ask them once Cecilia has finished her section. So please start popping questions into the chat. Thank you. Cecilia?
Thank you so much, Sol, and thank you also EYP for inviting me and for organizing all of this. It's great to interact with you all. I guess my remarks are going to elevate all of this to the global level. So I'm not going to talk about my country unless I have time, or perhaps in the discussion later on. I'm going to talk about the impact of nationalism and populism on global and European governance, including funding for certain thematic areas, but also voting patterns in the Security Council, in the EU institutions, etc. And then secondly, I want to discuss the interlinkages between populism and nationalism, and sort of this anti-gender equality, women's rights rhetoric. And if I have time, which I highly doubt, I'm going to discuss Finland a little bit too. So let me start with Europe, as we're at EYP now. And so good to be back at EYP. So as you know, for the past 10 years in the EU, we've experienced pretty much only crisis. If you've read basic European integration theory, we know that the history of Europe is a history of crisis and then integration, and that we always have ups and downs. But right now, as a lawyer, I like to look at EU integration through the treaties. And we haven't seen any treaty reform since the Lisbon Treaty, which entered into force in 2009. So we haven't been able to look at the EU very strategically in the past few years. And we haven't even properly consolidated the Lisbon Treaty, if you ask me. We haven't actually, been able to get out of the big debates such as the financial crisis, the so-called migration crisis, which I never like to call a crisis, Brexit. Now we're dealing with the rule of law challenges in Hungary, Poland, etc. And we've all kind of concluded that it's not the time for reform in Europe. And I don't think this is a very good thing, but at the same time, I would be really scared to open up the treaties right now. At the same time, we've also seen flexible integration. Flexible integration has always existed. If you've done EU studies, this means that some member states may go a little bit faster when it comes to integration. For example, my favorite example is so-called PESCO, permanent structured cooperation in defense policy, that member states, they pool their capabilities and see what others have, and then they maybe don't purchase those capabilities and do something else instead. This has always existed. This is a great thing. I think totally the way to go about integration, because this can also lead to really positive results, and others may want to join later on. What we have seen lately, which I don't think is very positive, is that member states go ahead, making statements among smaller groupings. For example, in the case of Hungary recently, when they handed over the emergency powers to the president, only 19 member states gave a statement, which I don't think gives an excellent, image of the state of EU integration right now. Now, how does all of this relate to the gender perspective and then to the UN? So I'd like to follow up a little bit on what Marcus said. There's quite a bit of research on how masculinities and populism are very interlinked. You've heard of machismo, you've heard of, locker talk in the context of Donald Trump, but it's not just him, it's Berlusconi, Putin, Bolsonaro. We've had Hindu nationalism, mass rapes, etc. It's all over the world. And you may have also heard that violence against women, gender-based violence, can be seen as an early indicator of social conflict, even conflict, wider conflict. We see this, for example, in the context of Syria, where I work. It's an early indication that worse things could happen. And
to wrap up your comments, please.
Yes, absolutely. So how do we see this in the UN? For example, now in the context of COVID-19, we've seen mass departures by the US from various organizations. We've seen the WHO recently, the Human Rights Council very recently too. They have reduced all of their funding from the UN Population Fund, where sexual and reproductive health and rights are one of the key priorities of the organization. We see less funds for the refugee crisis, less ability for the UN to respond to crisis. We see in the Security Council, when we try to introduce language as as UN women or as gender people in the UN system, there is a huge backlash. We have gone back like a decade when it comes to gender language and women's rights language. Of course, I want to also end in a positive note. It's not all negative. We've also seen more attention to women's rights and gender equality than we've ever seen before through, for example, the Me Too movement. We've seen more empathy among leaders than we have ever before in New Zealand, in Europe, etc. You know, women lead and also men lead through empathy. And they use a rights-based approach. So as Mark has mentioned, I think it was Marcus who mentioned that, you know, social liberal values can counter populism and nationalism, and you can see that at the global level as well. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Cecilia. So thank you to all our panelists for their viewpoints. So could I ask, we've got a question here from Laura. So Laura, could I call on you, and if you could unmute yourself to ask your question? Do we have Laura there? Yeah, it's here. It says Laura has asked a question. So if Laura's not able to come on, I'll ask the question on behalf. It's in the chat. Is, do we know why there is a rise in nationalism and what its appeal is and what it's telling us about the average citizen? So perhaps I could address that first to Marcus, given your background and understanding in polling, and perhaps then Ezra, you could add some additional points to that.
Sure. It's a great.
Yes. Do we know why there is a rise in nationalism, what its appeal is, and what it tells us about the average citizen?
It's a great question. I think it tells us that the average citizen has lost out a lot from globalization. That globalization has been great if you're higher income, higher education, if you're liberal cosmopolitan and you happen to have be lucky enough to have taken part in a program like the European Youth Parliament, then life can have worked out very well for you. But for a lot of people, it hasn't. And when you get so dispossessed from the economic and cultural stability and security that you or your parents or your grandparents' generation previously enjoyed, when deindustrialization happens, deregulation of labor markets, declining trade union power happens, when wages go down, when migration rates and speed and scale of migration happens at a level unknown to you and your community previously, a lot of these things can make you feel insecure, and not unreasonably so. And that creates a perfect situation in which there needs to be a politics that you express. And if the traditional parties of the left and the right aren't able to deal with your core concerns and address them fairly without discriminating against you, then you'll very quickly see the nationalist politicians taking advantage of those legitimate concerns. And that's, I think, where this problem actually comes from.
Thank you, Marcus. Ezra?
Yes, I think I would. I was trying to hint at this in my introductory remarks. I think that we're not necessarily seeing a rise in nationalism per se. I mean, it's extremely difficult to make a blanket statement about the entire globe, or even just all of Europe, or even one single country. I'd say that what we are looking at is a lot of anti-globalization, which either expresses it in terms of nationalism or expresses itself in terms of left-wing approaches, or expresses itself in terms of racism or anti-immigration sentiment, or expresses itself in the forms of a blanket protest politics approach, where there's a rejection of traditional party politics. So we're seeing a lot of different ways in which there's a reaction to globalization and a belief that it's not delivering on its promises of greater wealth and well-being for everyone. I'd be wary of, I'm actually quite wary of a blanket statement that there is a global rise in nationalism. I don't see the data for that. So I'd actually say that what we're seeing is a new way of engaging with globalization, and some of that language is a nationalist one. As for the appeal, I think on the appeal front, I hinted at it in my introduction. It's a simple message. Nationalism offers a very simple explanation for very complex happenings in the world. It's quite simple. If only the nation can regain power and reorganize itself so that it's fully expressing the will of the nation, we're going to be fine. It's so seductive as a message. So I think it's quite easy to see why that message is much easier to sell than a complicated one from either the left or the center right, which tries to explain to citizens the ways in which they're going to have to trade off on various aspects of their economic, political, and social lives as they adapt to the world. I mean, my answer is actually quite Western centric. As for the rest of the world, in many ways, I think if we're talking about rising nationalism, in many cases where we've still got situations where you have countries in Asia and Africa where large amounts of resources are basically moving across borders. The wealth is moving across borders where citizens have never touched any of this wealth. So in that context, I think it's pretty of a no-brainer why people will be talking about more national ownership or, protectionist measures, because they never were touching this wealth. This wealth was never trickling down through taxes or through, other infrastructural benefits. And so I think it's quite natural that we're seeing a reaction to that in the form of parties that particularly emphasize kind of national protectionist measures, xenophobic measures. I think it's a bit of a no-brainer. But what does it tell us about the average citizen? Did you say average EU citizen or average citizen? Sorry, I just need to bring up the chat.
With average citizen.
The average citizen. What do I think? I think it tells us a lot about how identity matters a lot. And when identity and money, wealth issues are decoupled, which is what we're seeing that the classic models of politics, class-based politics, and in Europe at least, assumptions, our party systems in many countries are still very much structured around class-based politics. When identity and wealth issues are decoupled, we end up with a variety of parties in front of us. When we go to the ballot, booth, we have some choices to make, and none of them meet our identity or socioeconomic needs. That we're not getting an answer to those basic questions.
Great, thank you, Ezra. We have a question from Julius. Oh, sorry, no, Tim. First, Tim. I think that would link in to this, what we've just been talking about. So, Tim, could you ask your question and unmute yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for your insight into this topic. I'm really enjoying this conversation. So let me just find my question in the chat so I can read it off exactly as I posed it. Has it disappeared, or am I just inept at locating it?
It's at 5:33 p.m. You posted. If you go by timing, it's 5:33 p.m.
I still can't find it, but okay, there we go. So how do we talk about nationalism and populism without alienating people? Because often by trying to start such conversations, you can become a part of the problem. The PC liberal left trying to censor somebody's thoughts. I find it personally very difficult to engage in such conversations just because as soon as I approach people, I just get slapped on with this label. And then everything I say, any argument I present is obviously invalid just because of these labels that my conversation partner attached to me. Thank you.
So I'd actually, if I could direct to Daniel, because of your experience with what you were talking about, in particular with Twitter and etc., and it obviously works both ways, and the same then to Cecilia.
So I mean, and possibly I'm the worst person to ask this question of, because clearly it's not working in Scotland. No, I mean, I think that there's a couple of things here. I mean, and some of it relates to actually what Ezra was saying. But I mean, I think the first point is that straightforward contradiction doesn't work. You know, if you tell people that they're wrong, I mean, especially when they're making arguments based on identity, what you will do is not just essentially provoke disagreement, you will fundamentally alienate them. And I think that's one of the big problems that we've had in Scotland since the referendum. And that because the politics that's espoused by populists and nationalists is so bound up identity, it's not just that core belief, but actually the things that they attach to it. So you have to be very careful. But then the second point, and it relates to what I was talking about with narrative, is that simply trying to come up with alternative propositions and say, well, look, listen to us because we're going to hand out lollipops and sweeties. That doesn't work either. I mean, fundamentally, you have to make your arguments about, well, look, you know, here is what we're talking about and how we relate to you. There are some very good bits of academic work about kind of narrative construction, but at the core of them are three elements. You tell a story about yourself, you tell the story about us, which is the collective whole, and then you tell a story about now, about why the imperative. Now, actually, populists and nationalists do this all the time, but it's not their exclusive territory. And I think we need to build our own stories about how our beliefs will tackle the problems, whether you're from the center left or center right, and how we connect fundamentally to the wider people. So it's actually not so much about what you're saying, but it's how you're saying it.
Thank you, Daniel. And Cecilia?
Yeah, I have to agree with what Daniel just said. I guess, I mean, my best example always these days is my work with the Syrian women that are trying to, you know, have dialogues with each other, even though, you know, their family members have been killed by maybe some of the family members of the other women that are in dialogues with each other. And somehow they still manage to be in the same room with each other, and they manage to, you know, show empathy because they acknowledge that they, you know, both sides, or, you know, all sides, they all experience pain. And I think this is the key in empathy. I will never, ever validate anyone's opinions when it comes to racism or xenophobia, but I can empathize with poverty, with permanent illness, with marginalization, regional marginalization, you know, marginalization of certain groups in society, unemployment. And it's about reaching out to those people and really ask them, what would you like me to do for you? And even asking those questions and to be out there and to do politics very differently. We don't have to talk about you know, populism or nationalism. We don't have to label people, because labeling is actually the most counterproductive thing you can do. I think in Finland, for instance, where we used to have this culture of very boring politics, to be honest. And I've realized afterwards that this was the greatest thing ever, that we weren't actually fighting with each other and we weren't using very polarizing terms. But now with, you know, social media and you know, with our politics becoming maybe a little bit more mainstream European, I noticed that, you know, the language that is being used is a lot more violent. I guess not violent, but, you know, just a little bit more confrontational. And I think we really need to pay attention to the language that we use and reach out to those communities and do politics through the means that, you know, they feel comfortable with. We've seen, you know, people in Finland rise to the European Parliament through €500 campaigns on Instagram, just because they really knew how to reach young people or certain communities, etc. So it's all about, you know, changing the way we do politics. I think that's really essential. Thanks.
Thank you, Cecilia. Just ask Julius to call on if you could ask your question, if you're ready to do that, please.
Yeah, so I'm wondering about, I'm Austrian, but I'm now living in the UK, and I think that the key issue with this whole populism going on, and especially currently in the UK, I can witness this very, very vividly, that there is a problem with media. So what kind of media people consume, and there is a problem on the recipient side as well, which is, I think, a lack of education and a lack of civic education, to be precise. And I'm wondering, apart from obviously saying, well, more EYP and increasing our activity as EYP and our outreach, what can we do in order to get that civic education, to get that that enlightenment in terms of how politics works and how media works to the people? I really think that if we want to have an enlightened democracy, and a democracy that actually works, and a democracy that is able to put forward more power to the people, then we first need to have proper education, because otherwise what happens with direct democracy is what happens with referenda at the moment, which is that populists tend to abuse them for their cause. And so this is what I'm asking, how we can increase the civic education also outside the EYP bubble, or if there is another way to reach the same goal that I just mentioned.
Thank you, Julius. I'll send that question to Ezra first, and I saw, Marcus, you had a reaction, so I'm going to send it to you after that, if that's okay. But Daniel and Cecilia, do feel welcome to jump in after Ezra and Marcus have spoken, if there's anything you particularly passionately feel about this question. So Ezra, if you could go, yeah, thank you.
I don't know the ins and outs of each country in the, I mean, we're talking about the EU here, so I don't know the ins and outs of civic education in each country. I know that I undertook civic education in Turkey, but that civic education was extremely nationalist. It was extremely statist, and it was very much about encouraging young people to buy into one particular vision of the nation, the state, and the world. So when people say civic education to me, I think it's brilliant. But it depends who's in charge of administering that civic education. But I definitely think you're onto something. I actually think that there's a role there for the European Union. I know it's extremely sensitive, but I actually think if there was one or two areas where the European Union should be really pushing for a direct connection with its citizens, it's youth civic education. I would really say that would be one area to really like fight it out, to push for direct EU engagement. I'd say that one key thing, and I think this speaks to all the adults, because I think we've got, if we focus only on youth education, we're still losing out on two other generations who are still out there. And I'd say that the number one thing is that I think mainstream politicians need to engage very directly with the issue of EU, how the EU works, and how the institutions work, and how national governments and states are absolutely crucial and the most important actors within EU governance. And until we have that really honest debate, clear debate, I don't really see a way of getting ahead, one step ahead of the anti-EU political movements. I cannot see any other way of doing it other than head-on addressing how the EU, how member states are in fact the most important actors within the European Union. And if we don't have that debate, then we're leaving. The platform is left open for populists to completely misrepresent how the EU works.
Thank you, Ezra. Marcus, would you like to add to that?
So, Julius, if I may, I'd like to push back a little bit on this, because I worry sometimes, I'm sure this is what you meant, but I'm worried sometimes a bit about people who say the problem is with the voters aren't smart enough, the voters need more education. If only the voters were clever or read different media, then they'd make different choices. Because from my part, I strongly believe that there are sort of two basic rules of politics here. Rule number one is the voters are always right. And rule number two is that even when the voters are wrong, see rule number one. We have to be good Democrats, and that means we have to trust the voters. We can't ask the voters to trust us. It doesn't work that way round. If our response to a political problem is the voters aren't clever enough, or the voters are reading the wrong newspapers, then that is not a failure of the voters, that's a failure of us to properly respect and understand, empower and include the voters in our democracy. And I go back to this word democracy because I think it's our way out of this entire problem. And I really liked what Ezra was saying about that in her opening. And I think, again, a lot these days in these questions about Willy Brandt's famous quote, "We must dare more democracy." It is exactly at this time when voters seem so volatile and so inclined to make what we may well consider to be dangerous choices around Trump or Brexit or what have you, that it is more important than ever that we trust the voters with the power to make the decision. Because only if we show the trust to them, do I think we have any chance of them showing trust in us in return.
Thank you, Marcus. I think Daniel wanted to jump in quickly on this.
Yeah. So, 100% what Marcus was just saying. I used to be in retail before I was in politics, and the customer is always right. The voters are never wrong. But on top of that, and what Marcus has just said, I think there's not only is it, I think, the wrong instinct. I think actually it potentially fundamentally misunderstands what's changed in terms of the way that people get their information, and I think there's some sort of thought that a centralized, state-led, education program can counter what is going on in social media. I think is just completely wrong. Actually, what we need is to understand these new means by which people gain their information, and we need to participate in it. I think this sort of that the only way that we will counter these I think quite dangerous narratives is by creating our new ones and being involved in them. That is absolutely about the main political parties. It might well be about aspects of the state, it might be about the EU, but it's also about us and the way we talk in our communities and the way we organize, because actually a lot of this information is hyper local or very small, and it requires engagement to provide alternative viewpoints.
Thank you, Daniel. I think just before we're kind of running a little bit behind time, so we may run over just a slight amount, if that's okay. One of the subheadings for this debate was like, what can EYPers do to contribute, or how can we have an impact in this space? So it'd be interesting to see if you had any particular views on this. Cecilia, is that something I could send your way as a first question? Yeah, and it'd be great to get all the other panelists' views on this too.
Okay, thank you, Sol. Well, I keep on talking about empathy, so I'm going to stop with that. But maybe I saw a really interesting tweet the other day, and it was about recognizing privilege and also how you can actually, turn that into action. And it was a criticism of so-called white allies in this Black Lives Matter debate. And, we all talk about diversity and inclusion and multiculturalism, and in EYP we've done that too, and it's great that EYP has become much more inclusive since I left. But it's not just about inclusivity or multiculturalism. The tweet that I saw was about not just recognizing your own privilege and that you hold a certain space, but your willingness to give it up as well. And I think it's really important for us as active European citizens, not necessarily for us to aspire to be part of decision-making and to give more space to young Europeans who already have a voice in a way, but to really maybe support people who normally don't have that space. And I'm not talking only about, persons of color, but also persons of, in Finland, in marginalized areas, to take part in politics and EYP. Maybe we can try and come up with more nationally appealing concepts like EYP, because EYP as a concept already is a little bit elitist, and very much enjoy whatever EYP is about, but I think we should also try and include young people, marginalized young people at the very local levels in similar dialogue processes, and really recognize our privilege in that regard, and not sort of try and convince people that Europe is such a great project and that integration is desirable as such, but recognize that there is real pain in these communities, in all kinds of communities, and you know, design our approaches accordingly. So yeah, that's maybe my my input in that regard.
Thank you. Which other panelists would like to go? Ezra, perhaps you'd like to answer that one. So the question is, what can EYPers do or to have an impact in this space?
Well, I'd say three things. I'm not sure whether EYP still has the same structure that it had in the late 90s when I participated, but fundamentally it was about team building, which was, you know, considered the really fun bit, the bit which at the time as a teenager, I thought, why are we doing this bit? Can't we just get on with the serious stuff? Then so you had the team building, then you had the committee work, then you had the plenary. And actually it was like genius, because obviously as a slightly dorky, geeky teenager, I was missing the point that unless you build a team beforehand, you're not going to be able to deal with tricky topics. So in that sense, I think, and this goes back to the question that that was asked earlier. I'm sorry, I've forgotten the name of the, was it Tim, I think, asked the question about how to have discussion without alienating. And I think really it's about building like quality relationships with people before you really get into into trying to debate the hardest topics that we face. And then on top of that, I think what was very interesting about EYP was the way in which committee work, the structure, the committee work forced us to focus on finding consensus and finding something we agreed on. So we'd arrive with different opinions. Often it would be quite polarized within committee work, but the emphasis that you had to have something at the end, there had to be a product at the end that would be taken to the plenary. And in that sense, I think if we can find ways of making the debates less polarized and less about just stating your position and fighting it out, but actually about trying to find common ground, we'll be going quite far. And I actually think that of all the things EYP taught me, that was one of the things, that when you're in a room with people who disagree, it's very important that everybody gets their say, but what can we agree on? What can we agree on? And I think so much of politics today, I mean, maybe Daniel can say something more nuanced than me about this, but you know, so much of the debate is about what we don't agree on. How can we get to a point where we're spending more time and energy on the things that we do agree on, so that we can actually have things that change, you know, reform, rather than constant deadlock and gridlock, which brings us back to Cecilia's original point about the fact that the EU is in a constant state of crisis management, rather than you know, looking at really how to improve EU governance.
Great, thank you, Ezra. I'll ask Daniel to go next, because I think that's I mean, actually, that's an interesting point to hand over on, in that, I mean, actually, one of the odd things in the Scottish Parliament is on a day-to-day basis, there's a huge amount of consensus and actually not as much disagreement as you might think. But then when there is, it becomes extremely heated and all about the Constitution. In a sense, I mean, I find, I mean, I think this is going to sound contradictory, but I think ultimately it's not. I think what Cecilia says is absolutely spot on about recognizing privilege and building a politics that I think enables people that haven't had power. But at the same time, I think there is a real responsibility for those that do have, who are in a position to do things, to do something about it. I mean, I mean, one of my things I find odd following EYP is that, I mean, there aren't a huge number of us who are elected politicians. And I think there's a sense in which people of our generation have opted to do other things than public service. And there is a part of the problem there. And I think the key to reconciling that contradiction is, if you have the possibility of participating, you should, but when you do, you must absolutely ensure that you're putting the ladder down, not pulling it up. That you're extending opportunity, and that fundamentally, I mean, I think our way through this is that, you know, if I look at certainly my politics, centre-left politics, that's fundamentally should be a politics of empowerment,
about giving people more possibility in their lives, not less. And I think you know, the left's politics actually drifted away from that and became about paternalistic, you know, here is what you shall be given and you shall be pleased to have it. And actually it was never about that. And it must return to that point of empowerment. And actually my fundamental point, and it relates a bit to the education point, you know, I think we need to be constantly reminding ourselves that unless our politics is about, you know, being relevant to people's day-to-day lives and making those things better and actually giving them more choice critically, then we're failing. You know, if I look at a lot of the analysis that's been going on within my party, within the Labour Party following the general election, it has talked a lot about we need to explain our policies better, we need to educate people more. It's absolutely not about that. You know, it's about making our policies, our politics more importantly, relevant and actually of practical use and benefit to the population at large.
Thank you, Daniel. And Marcus, if you could wrap up that question, I think that will be the last comment for this panel debate.
Sure. So I loved Ezra's context of there's team building, there's committee work, there's GA, and there's things that we can learn from each of them. But there's a fourth and an absolutely equally important component of EYP sessions that can also tell us something about what we can do next, and that is nightlife. At night, we used to go out to bars, usually an Irish pub. And what would happen is we would have a drink with someone. We'd probably have a drink with someone that we wouldn't have normally had a drink with. We would have a conversation with that person. Sometimes other things would happen. But the important thing is we would learn about someone else's world that we would never have encountered otherwise. And one of the best things that we can do in all of this tremendously confusing politics is find a way to have a sociable conversation, a pint in a pub with someone who doesn't have the same background as you, isn't from the same place, doesn't share the same politics as you. And if you do those things, they will learn about you and you will learn about them, and that will make all of our politics so much better.
Thank you, Marcus. So I think given timing, we'll have to wrap up the panel there. Some of the things I've picked up in terms of themes are around really about the politics of empowerment, as Daniel said, and using the privilege and power and responsibility that perhaps that privilege or that access gives us. And I don't mean necessarily privilege in terms of our backgrounds, but the privilege we have from having experienced the EYP and having had that education and understanding and using that knowledge and skill in our lives. And particularly the other message that came out was around empathy. As Marcus said, walking in another person's shoes, having that drink, sharing that understanding. I think those are the themes I'm going to be really taking with me. So thank you to the panelists. Thank you to Ezra, Cecilia, Marcus and Daniel for your time, your thoughts, your comments, your wisdom. And I would like to wrap that up there. If I could just have a quick clap, if you could like to unmute, that would be very nice for our panelists. Thank you.
Doing the EYP clap.
I don't know. Thank you so much. So what we're going to do is we're going to stay in this particular room. So just if you're going to take, we're going to take a 5-minute break, or even less than that, probably a 3-minute break. So please stay in the room. Just either turn your video off or mute yourself, and we'll come back ideally in 3 minutes time. So 10 past the hour to do the closing of the reunion. Thank you very much, everyone. So please stay in the room.
10 different professional fields coming together in industry talks. And without having also a permanent alumni officer at the office working on it, I think it's a very EYP thing to manage to pull it off. And it says a lot about the potential in our network that we could get such interesting speakers and attendees together. We have 3 quick questions for you to wrap up together. If you can take us, Helena, to Mentimeter one more time, and if you can all take your phones and go to menti.com. And you, yes, wonderful. So if you, one person you got to know through this weekend, if you can type it in, the code, if you don't see it on the screen, it's 266583. We had quite a lot of opportunities for chats, and I think it was really cool that different people showed up for different elements. And I think some of the people we see with the bigger names, some of them have been taking lead in the industry talks. We have Daniel, Melissa, Xenia. We also have Severin, Kate, Nick, Zara, Esra, Emmanuel, Oleg, Henna, Bettina Carr. That's true. We also got to know Bettina, the founder of EYP. It was really cool to get to talk to her and hear from her. What else? Jorg, Hedy, Barbara, Chris, Carolina, Nora, and many more. If we go to the next question. How would you describe the experience for you, whatever extent you participated in one word? Twitter, easy, cute, inspiring, reawakening. Really, really, really cool. Nostalgic, insightful, carbon neutral. That's very good. Connecting, brilliant, awesome, flashback, thought-provoking, reminiscent, history, challenging, welcome. It's definitely, I think, the silver lining of this is we discovered a format that allows us to really come together from all different corners of the world. And it's so easy to talk to each other because we have this common history with EYP. Wonderful. Thank you very much for sharing. Feel free to keep adding if you have other ideas, and we'll definitely share the final picture. One more question for you now that will come up through a Zoom poll, so it should come up on our screen. If you think about, these are some of the things we aimed to achieve with this alumni reunion, and we want to see the extent to which we did so. So which of the statements you agree or identify with? Just going to take 20 more seconds. Okay. And you can now see the results as well. We're going to send a more extensive evaluation form. It'd be really useful for us if you filled it in, because it enables us to learn how we can do the next one even better. Sol, do you want to continue?
Thank you, Maria. So I don't know how to describe it, but I'm getting VPD at the moment, which is virtual post-EYP depression, because it feels like a little bit sad at the moment to be saying goodbye to all of you after having spent the weekend with you all. So I really just wanted to say a few thank yous. Really, my first thank you is to all of you for coming on, taking the time out to participate in the reunion. We can't do it without you and your happy, smiling faces, sometimes tired faces at the end of the drinks, but has been lovely to see, and I'm really proud that we've been able to share this weekend together. So thank you to all of you as participants. I just wanted to also say thank you to all of our speakers. We had, I won't be able to mention all of them in time, but particularly to the panel members, so Bettina, Philip, and Anya. We had obviously the speakers' corners, and all the industry networking talks, which are fantastic that all the various people stood up to lead those. And obviously to our panel members as well, so Marcus, Cecilia, Daniel, and Ezra that we had just now. I'd also very much like to thank the Alumni Coordination Group. Over the last 2-3 years, various people have been involved in various aspects. I probably won't be able to get all the names right, but Daria, Seamus, Stephen, Maria, Elka, Marcus was there for a while. Please forgive me if I miss your names off. And as I said, those people have all put a lot of work in. In particular, I wanted to thank the EYP office. So they've really been the driving force behind all of this. And in particular, Anya, and even more so Helena, who's pretty much been working 12, 13-hour days for the last 2-3 weeks to get this together. So if everyone could unmute themselves, I'd very much like a round of applause for So just kind of a final wrap up. So, you know, this is your community, and I know we call it a network, but I actually feel community is the right word, that the EYP community, and this is yours. So we are here to serve you. So tell us what you need, and we're happy to try to do our best to make that a reality for you as the EYP community. You know, the ways to get involved, I think you've seen already. We can get involved in various ways, like mentorship. We've had 145 participants so far in the mentorship scheme. We're asking for coordinators within cities to help lead the efforts there, and also now industry coordinators, if anyone would like to take that on. In particular, we're looking for door openers. We will mention this a bit more in various forms, but EYP has suffered a lot from reductions in funding. So anything you can do to get us access to foundations or corporates that would be interested in kind of supporting the efforts of EYP, particularly in the times that we're in now, it would be really appreciated. The other thing we'd love to do is to have you help expanding the network. So please invite your friends. So an exercise I would recommend to all of you is go through your Facebook friends and make sure that they're all part of the alumni page on Facebook, and the same for LinkedIn. You'd be surprised. I did that and I ended up adding 20 people to both groups because I couldn't believe that they weren't already part of those groups. So I guarantee you there'll be lots of your EYP friends who are not members of the alumni Facebook page and the LinkedIn page. And if there's anything you need, you know, if we're not able to deliver it, I mean, you guys go and take the lead. Like, we're happy for you to start taking the lead on items. You know, your EYPers, you could probably take 100 euros if you had to and feed 250 starving teenagers. I'm pretty sure that you could all achieve a result like that, as you know from our experiences. So, you know, anything you need there. And just kind of a finishing note, I do believe that this is a community like no other. I don't think that, if you remember from my intro, that there exists a community with this level of reach, power, kind of ability to have that potential to have a seriously positive impact in the world. You know, we've got people that lead countries, we've got ambassadors down to doctors, veterinarians. I really think that there's a massive potential in our community. And for me, it would be a real shame if I look back at the end of my life and said, you know, if we could only just have done this with the alumni, or, you know, we could have done something with that. And I feel like a lot of people have that same sense. So, you know, we're not sure what that looks like, but I think if we all work together and put some effort in, I think there'll be some amazingly positive things we can do in the world. And as you know, the world needs it right now. So thank you again for everyone.